Greetings brothers, today we're going to be looking at 5 ways you can use strategic reserves to be surprisingly effective in your games of Warhammer 40,000. So let's get straight into it, brothers, and you might have noticed the sneaky Leviathan Dreadnought here, but yeah, we're talking about surprisingly effective strategic reserves. So I want to start just going over very quickly how strategic reserves work, and if you want to skip past this part in the video, I'll put a timestamp down below. So when you put a unit into strategic reserve, it can't arrive in the game in battle round 1, it arrives in turn 2, within 6 inches of a battlefield edge, not the enemy battlefield edge, and not within the enemy deployment zone, and then in turn 3, again, not the enemy battlefield edge, but this time it can be in their deployment zone. Obviously it needs to be 9 inches away from enemy models. When you arrive, it's same as deep strike, you can't make a normal move, advance, or fall back. Strategic reserves always have count as moving, so if you're bringing in like heavy weapons, they would be -1 to hit. Why would you put units into strategic reserve then? And there's multiple reasons. Obviously you have a specific secondary you think you can score good on. Engage on all fronts and retrieve Nachman data are the two that stand out. You have a significant enemy unit that is going to be a super big threat. I guess, you know, if you're playing against the new Tau and they've got those crazy 12 damage guns that ignore invulnerable saves that can kill a Dreadnought in one shot, then maybe you want to keep your Dreadnought into strategic reserve because you want to at least be able to shoot it before it gets killed off the board. You might want to conceal units from enemy firepower and you look at your side of the board and you don't think there's enough obscuring cover, so you might want to strategic reserve some units like that. Or there could be another tactic I've not mentioned here, but there is definitely value in strategic reserves, and I've been using strategic reserves pretty consistently now for probably going on 6 to 8 months. And obviously strategic reserves work on power level, and the chart is over here, so if you keep it under 9 power level it's going to cost you 1, if you keep it between 10 and 19 it's going to cost you 2. I never tend to go over that, but I guess this gives you a good example, and I think that the 1 CP for up to 9 power level in strategic reserve used right can be very strong. So what I've been doing, and this was a suggestion for one of my community members actually, to put Assault Intercessors into strategic reserve, and I actually comboed this with a squad of Servitors. So let's talk about why this was good. And this was always going to cost me 1 CP because the Assault Intercessors are 5 power level, the Servitors are 2 power level, so that's 7 power level, so 1 CP. And I did this in a recent GT where I ran all the way to the top table and essentially finished second. Now, Servitors, they've got a nice small base size, they can squeeze into almost any quadrant, they'll still be able to perform engage on all fronts in the new chapter approved because you need to have 3 models in the squad, and a Servitor squad is obviously 4 models. Retrieve Nachman data, I guess they've got a 66% chance if you want to do that, in that you have to roll a d6. If it would be less than the number of the squad, the 4, they can perform data. And the only downside with the Servitors is they are an elite choice, but if you do have a Tech Marine in your list then you get to include Servitors for free. And my experience with chapter approved 2022 is generally secondaries are now harder to score, so a 30-point Servitor unit might still be useful, especially for engaging all fronts. If you can put them into like an obscure defensible position and just have them chill out there, hold that quadrant of the board, there's certainly definitely value in that for 30 points. I'm still going to be running my Tech Marines, so there's a good chance you may still see me run Servitors every now and then. Assault Intercessors on the other hand, and these guys are normally 5 power level, so I always find you can put them in with something else, typically, and we'll get onto the something else that's also pretty effective soon. But Assault Intercessors, good for engaging all fronts, good for retrieve Nachman data. In chapter approved 2022 they can now do other actions that are very useful. For example, we just played a map where if I could prime explosives in the half of the opponent's battlefield, then I would get 4 victory points. So, and it was 100% reliable if it's a troop model, and Assault Intercessors are. Another thing to say is these are kind of the cheapest Primaris troops you can get at 95 points. So Primaris troops we know are more survivable than, you know, tacticals, but if you just wanted a super cheap of Primaris troops, then Assault Intercessors are your guys. And the one other thing to say about the Assault Intercessors is obviously they're OBSEC, and if you think about the enemy holding their backfield objective potentially with a single model, in my case I often hold my backfield objective with my Whirlwind. Sometimes I'll have a squad there, but sometimes if I feel confident I'll move out. Well, if you have a squad of Assault Intercessors coming in, if they can make the charge, 26 attack, strength 4, -2, 1 damage with +1 to wound, I mean they're not going to kill, for example, a Whirlwind, but you'll probably be able to pile at least 2 of them onto the objective and, you know, flip that primary, denying your opponent 4 points and maybe even 8 points. If they end up scoring 1 less because you've now got OBSEC units on their backfield, in your turn it means you have more. Yeah, that's an 8-point swing from a 1 CP in a very cheap squad of Assault Intercessors. So I like this tactic. I think you could also do this in Cursors, but I think if you want the cheapest models you can get, Assault Intercessors can do this. Putting them in strategic reserves gives you a few different options for scoring points, and scoring points is how you win games, right? So a very effective way to use your Assault Intercessors. Often I've found if I deploy my Assault Intercessors on the board, they get chewed up before they get to where they need to be because they can't move as effectively from cover to cover as jump units. So this is one way I've been making them work now for a good 6 to 8 months, like I said. Now let's talk about unit number 2, and unit number 2 I guess is your Leviathan, your Contemptor, or your Redemptor. And as the meta progresses in 9th edition, and damn does it progress, I think is what I want to write, Admech, Custodes, Tau, they all have extremely effective ways to just delete vehicles from the game. It certainly feels like damage is rising over this edition, and like a lot of armies have very reliable damage. Cognus las cannons, the Custodes bikes, the Tau with the hammerheads and all this. So it might now be difficult. If you want to run a double Dreadnought list, which I recommend, if you're going to run one Dreadnought, I always sort of recommend you should have 2. If you're going to run that double Dreadnought list, would it be worth putting one of them into strategic reserve? A Relic Contemptor can go in for 8, Leviathan goes in for 13, and a Redemptor goes in for 9. And these Dreadnoughts, as Blood Angels, all have really good melee options. They're all going to get 6 attacks if you bring them in turn 3, so a base of 4 plus 1 from Savage Echoes plus 1 from Shock Assault, and they're all hitting at strength 14, so that's wounding everything in the game on 2s. The Redemptor and the Relic Contemptor are obviously core, and they basically are all doing about an average of 4 damage plus. I recommend you take the Chain Fist or the Siege Drill, and then the Redemptor, there's no option on the melee. But all these Dreadnoughts now can essentially be quite spicy if strategic reserved. And I haven't been strategic reserving the Dreadnoughts all that often, but I did play against a 10 knight list just this week, and I actually strategically reserved the Leviathan in that game because I thought he would be a very, very good counter against the large knight, and he did come in and he did do 18 damage in a single round of combat, and that was after he shot another knight off the table. Combo that with Null Zone rather for some added spice. You know, not many things are going to save at -4, -5, and flat 6 damage versus vehicles from the Relic Contemptor and the Leviathan is very nice, but I actually don't think the Redemptor's any chump here. I mean, he's doing an average of 5 damage, D3 plus 3, and he is also core, and he does also fit for 1 CP reserve. So another thing to say is with the new Engage on All Fronts rule, you're going to need vehicle models in quarters to score Engage on All Fronts, and all the 3 Dreadnoughts have the vehicle keywords. That is another very effective thing that you could use strategic reserve for. It's not something that you see all that often, but I think it's definitely something to consider depending on what you're playing up against. And spoiler alert for Monday night, where I do play the new Tau, there's a very high chance that one of my Dreadnoughts will be in strategic reserve, because I feel like if I try and walk it across the battlefield to get into melee, it'll be shot off the table. There's no chance of it getting in. So let's move on to number 3. So I want to focus on the 2 cheapest Landspeeders here. And the Landspeeder for 70 points with the multi-melta. If it arrives from strategic reserve, it's very easy to place within half range of the multi-melta, adding reliability to its damage roll. At 3 power level, you know, 3 of these could be placed in strategic reserve for 1 CP. Again, they're helping you score Engage on All Fronts. There's a bit of synergy here with the Landspeeder and the Whirlwind, giving the Whirlwind plus 1 to hit, which is nice if the target's within 18 inches. I don't really rate that high, but I guess if some people feel like they want the Whirlwind to do a little bit more damage, it would increase the damage of the Whirlwind. I have previously used attack bikes in strategic reserve to snipe exposed enemy characters, and you could do that precisely the same way with a Landspeeder. You know, if you've got something else that can kill out a squad of models, and then you could put the Landspeeder down from strategic reserve so that the enemy character is then the closest. You know, 2 multi-melta hits at half range. If the character fails a single one, that's potentially 8 damage. You know, that potentially has the ability to kill just about any Space Marine or Drukhari or, you know, like non-monster character in the game. Not many of them have more than 8 wounds. I think about Gilliman, but I guess technically he's a monster. So Landspeeders coming in from strategic reserve, I think we're going to see more of them. I have just bought one of them and I may buy another, and obviously Landspeeders have great maneuverability within 18 inches, so if you do end up needing to move them quadrant to quadrant or something like that, there's certainly the ability to do that too. So the second one would be our Landspeeder Storm, and at 55 points it's a real interesting proposition as well, because it costs no CP to place into reserve. It's actually got a rule called Outflank, and Outflank is very similar to strategic reserve. However, It's wholly within 6 inches of any battlefield edge and no more than 9 away from enemy models, so you can arrive on any battlefield edge that you want with the Landspeeder Storm. It obviously has a bit less damage and it's got a heavy bolter and like basically like a frag launcher. It's the Cerberus launcher with D6 blast, strength 4, 0 AP, 1 damage. So quite a little bit less damage, but it is 15 point less, and it does have that free outflank. Also has a neat stratagem you can use later in the game to prevent overwatch and also debuff an enemy -1 to hit in shooting and in melee. So 2 very effective speeders that can get multiple of them into strategic reserve for very, very cheap in terms of command points, and can basically score you points throughout the entire game. I think that having some Landspeeders as we move into 2022 is going to be key for Blood Angels to just continue to score well throughout most games. Let's talk next about our new Death Company Gravis Captain. So this model just came out this Saturday. If you want to buy it from Element Games, you can use the link in the description below, and every purchase will help the channel out a little bit. Now, I've kind of thought about this guy a couple of times, and here I've got kind of a spicy option for him. He comes in at 120 points. And he is Gravis Captain, so his movement isn't great at 5, but everything else is pretty good, including toughness 5 and 7 wounds, so he is survivable. He comes with either a chainsword and a power sword, or a power fist, and then the Bolt Storm Gauntlet. So what I thought you could do is, let's add him to the Death Company for 20 points. So that increases him to 7 power level, and he gains the Black Rage, so that's +1 attack, and a 6+ Feel No Pain that he gets. Let's add Imperium Sword, so he rerolls charges. He gets +1 strength, +1 attack on the charge or on heroic interventions. So basically at this point you're on 7 attacks, and you can have +1 strength and you have reroll charges. So what that means is if you're coming in from strategic reserve, then you're always going to reroll your charge, and you're going to need to roll an 8. So 8 with a reroll. In fact, I think it's just above 65%, so you're talking basically 2 out of 3 times he will perform this charge successfully. Now what we could do is we could mastercraft this Bolt Storm Gauntlet. So basically the Bolt Storm Gauntlet is essentially a power fist, so it's ×2 strength, so it would be strength 8, -3, 2 damage, -1 to hit obviously with the Bolt Storm Gauntlet, but basically what that will do is give us a 3 damage power fist essentially. Remember, we're going to have +1 strength, so we're actually going to be on strength 9, and then we're going to have +1 to wound, so even against toughness 8 we're going to be wounding on 2s. So we can also equip him with a chainsword for 3 extra attacks, or a power sword for 2 extra attacks, and both of those weapons will also benefit from the +1 strength of Imperium Sword, so it'd be like a strength 5 chainsword or a strength 6 power sword. I think personally I prefer the power sword, just because you're going to get 2 attacks with that power sword due to his Gravis fighting styles, and they will also be -3, and if this is on turn 3 or onwards when we're in Assault Doctrine, both the power fist and the power sword will be -4. So that gives him a total of 11 attacks. Now, here's a Death Company character, so we do get the ability to run a Death Vision, and the Death Vision I would recommend here is on the Bridge of the Vengeful Spirit. So if we make that charge and we get in, we can then play on the Bridge of the Vengeful Spirit, and all we need to do to be able to play that is we need to be able to see an enemy character or a monster character. If we can see them, then we're going to get +1 attack for every 5 enemies within 6 inches, and we're going to reroll all our hits. So we're going to have our 11 attacks, 9 on our 3 damage power fist, 2 on our 1 damage power sword, potentially 2 or 3 extra attacks depending on what you charge into. If you're going after like a single hard hitting enemy though, then maybe no extra attacks, but you will reroll all your hits to add some reliability to that Bolt Storm Gauntlet that would normally only hit with 3s. I do, in my army list, also run Quake Bolts, so if you're able to Quake Bolt your character, then you would basically hit on 2s, and you would reroll all your 1s, and then you wound on 2s. I mean, with 9 attacks coming in, it's essentially 9 Thunderhammers at that point, but with better AP than the Thunderhammer has now. So 9 Thunderhammer attacks, that's potentially like 27 damage, and then 2 more power swords. So this guy can actually do 29 damage, assuming that you do not get any bonus attacks. If, I don't know, they had like a Dreadnought next to like a couple of squads of guys, it could easily be you get an extra attack or 2. I think this guy's quite spicy. He would be 140 points, but could he provide value? Yeah, 100% think so. Alright, let me go back to strategic reserves for a second, and I've talked about so many times about how Phobos units are so useful and why you should include multiple squads of these, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Nachman data and how with 2 squads of these you can perform Nachman data really simply, and this also kind of ties into the strategic reserve idea. So you would deploy your Phobos units on the board, and I've said one way you could do them is to deploy the Phobos units into the quadrant of your board which contains your deployment zone, let's say that's A, and the most defensible adjacent sector, let's say that B. So our deployment zone is here, we got a unit of Phobos in here. In turn 1, we'd either do Nachman data on whichever section we think has got the most pressure. So if we're not confident we can hold our deployment zone, do it in A. If we're not confident we can hold B, we do it in B. So we've done that section. In turn 2, perform Nachman data on other section and play 1 CP to play guerrilla tactics and put the pressured unit back into strategic reserve. So now, at the end of turn 2, we've done both the sectors here, and we have our unit in strategic reserve. In turn 3, we're essentially going to return to the board in C or D, either or, and perform Nachman data in there, and then that means essentially when we start our turn 4, let's say we did that on C, so we've done ABC. Now in turn 4, we'd again be able to pay 1 CP and put either A or C back in strategic reserve to come back into section D. So what you can basically do is if you have 2 units of Phobos and you have 2 CP, you could almost guarantee 12 points from that secondary, assuming there's space on the board to bring them in, and you can work the rest of your army around creating that space for that very easy secondary. Guerrilla Tactics and Strategic Reserve is so valuable, and this is why I rate Intercessors as the best troop choice for their points in 9th edition in terms of getting the points from the data. These guys make it very easy to do and generally very reliable. But I want to give a shout out here to Tactical Marines, and often don't talk about Tactical Marines. I often say that they are trash, but if you wanted to do the cheapest guaranteed Nachman data that you can do, then I guess a squad of 5 Tactical Marines with just bolters at 90 points is going to be the cheapest way to do this. This may be my favourite use for Tactical Marines into Chapter Approved 2022. I probably won't be fielding them myself, but if you are going to be using strategic reserves and you do want to be them super effective, then you could use Tactical Marines as a cheap way to just score 4 points, and maybe if it's an engage on all fronts map as well, that could be 7 points, and if they can do that into an obscuring position and they can be there for a couple of turns, then that could be 10 points. So Tactical Marines at 90 points may have a place going into 2022. But for me personally, you'll still see me focus on my Incursors and my Assault Intercessors, which I mentioned earlier. I think these 2 units are very good if used correctly. Thank you so much for watching the weekly tactics video. I really appreciate it. And if you did get some value out of today's video, please consider hitting that like button so it can spread to other Warhammer players. This week on the channel, Blood Angels are going to take on the new Tau Codex on Monday night. It's going to be against Andrew, and I'm sure he's going to have some crazy meta list to face, so come and join us then. I'm not feeling confident, but as you know, we'll fight to last man and we will do our best. If you'd like to support the channel in every way and do know it is super appreciated, you can find the Patreon and other affiliate links down below. I for sure will catch you in the next video. By the blood are we made strong, brothers. Peace.